Whenever you're ready, we can go and get started.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today, and thank you to the Alliance for Academic Internal Medicine for having us here to share with you our talk, To Err is Human, A Just Culture's Reframing of the Case of RaDonda Vaught. My name is Matthew DeVeronica. I am a hospitalist at the Portland Healthcare, VA Portland Healthcare System, and chair of our Patient Safety Committee. I am joined today by a fantastic group of colleagues that I couldn't be more fortunate to work with. Dr. Anne Smeralio, also a hospitalist at the Portland VA and OHSU Internal Medicine Health System Science Director. Dr. Chris Turndrup, OHSU Primary Care Physician and Assistant Program Director for OHSU Internal Medicine Residency. And Dr. Ramya Prasad, the Portland VA Chief Resident of Quality and Safety, and as of this week, a hospitalist here at the Portland VA. Unable to join us today is Dr. Bryn McGee, also a hospitalist at the Portland VA. And this presentation came out of the work done by this excellent team of educators for the Wellbeing and Improvement Science Curriculum, or WISC, which is a curriculum for the internal medicine residents here at OHSU. The curriculum aims to help residents understand the healthcare system in which they function and the basics for quality improvement and patient safety. Now, shortly after the RaDonda Vaught news was popularized by media outlets, we had several interns ask us to discuss the case as part of WISC, and this presentation is an extension of what we built to talk with the residents about this case. Before we go further, we want you to know that none of the presenters today have any connection to the case or the various parties involved. And Dr. Smeralio receives remuneration from the AMA for work related to health system science. Our objectives today are to review and understand the facts around the case involving RaDonda Vaught, analyze them from a patient safety perspective, and then apply the just culture framework to the errors that were made. I would guess that most of you have seen news clips like this. Nurse found guilty in a woman's death. Nurse faces prison for deadly error. Colleagues worry. Could I be next? Whether you've only seen the headlines or extensively read the details, I imagine this case makes most of us uncomfortable. Seeing a healthcare team member be held criminally liable for an unintentional medication error. And this is what we will explore today. The error that led to a conviction of Vanderbilt Hospital nurse RaDonda Vaught for a tragic mistake that resulted in the death of a patient she was caring for. We want to lay out some ground rules around this discussion before we begin, because we recognize that this is a topic that many in healthcare feel strongly about, and those opinions will be widely divergent. First, we want to lay out a respect for a diversity of opinions around this case. We are not here to convince anyone about the morality or legality of this conviction. We will explore the facts that are available and analyze them through a patient safety lens. We also want to specifically acknowledge our nursing colleagues who have faced the heaviest load of scrutiny from this discussion, and we want to acknowledge a layer of fear that this adds to already burnt out nurses. We are patient safety experts. We deal in health systems, not laws. So we're going to explore the case and frame it around the idea of how we implement a just culture within a healthcare system. We are not going to be taking an extensive dive into the legal system and what may or may not be correct about it. We can explain the facts of how she was charged and convicted, but we won't talk about the legal theory nor the evidence that was used or not used in court. Our goal is to have you think about how health systems prepare for and respond to errors. We have no inside information into this case. The information we have collected is from CMS, published medical literature, media reports, and RaDonda's testimony at her nursing board hearing. Thus, there will be things that we do not know and cannot answer about what happened behind closed doors, both within Vanderbilt Hospital and within the jury room. We've done our best to find multiple sources to ensure the accuracy of this analysis, but we want to upfront acknowledge that there may be some errors within our presentation, and if that is the case, that we apologize. And lastly, we wanted to strongly encourage use of chat to move the conversation forward. We will have about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion towards the end, but we want to encourage people to use the chat liberally during the presentation. We also want to encourage people to put in suggestions on how we can continue this conversation after we finish today, as we recognize that 1 hour is not adequate time to address the breadth of this topic. Before we explore the case, we wanted to acknowledge the woman who lost her life in this tragedy, Charlene Murphy. We must remember that while this case will focus on the nurse, RaDonda Vaught, there was a human being who died and a family that mourned. We're going to start by walking through a timeline of the events around this case so that we can all be on the same page before we get to the details around the error that occurred. Nurse Vaught was hired at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in October of 2015. And from that time, from our understanding, she was in good standing with the hospital without any reports of unsafe behaviors or incidents. In December of 2017, Charlene Murphy was admitted for a traumatic brain injury. 2 days later, the physician ordered a PET scan and 1 to 2 milligrams of Versed for claustrophobia. And at this point, Nurse Vaught accidentally administers IV vecuronium, and the patient suffered a cardiorespiratory arrest. Later that day, the error was reported via the patient safety event reporting system. And the following day, the family decides to withdraw life support and the patient dies. Now, the medication error was not listed on the death certificate, and the medical examiner at that time listed the cause of death as natural and is not further investigated. And there is no reports made to any state officials for an unnatural death, which would have been required under Tennessee law. At that point, after that day, Nurse Vaught never set foot in that neuro ICU again. She, a week later, was fired from her position for not following the 5 rights of medication administration. And the 5 rights of medication administration is the nursing practice used to ensure that medications are being given appropriately, which include verifying that a nurse is giving the right patient, the right drug, at the right dose, via the right route, and at the right time. In January, the hospital settles with the patient's family and requires them to sign a non-disclosure agreement. In May of that year, Nurse Vaught is hired as a throughput coordinator as another institution. In October, almost 10 months after the incident, an anonymous whistleblower alerts the state and federal agencies about the error. Shortly thereafter, the Tennessee Department of Health Nursing Board makes a decision to not pursue any disciplinary action against Nurse Vaught. And around that same time, CMS conducted a surprise inspection and Vanderbilt submitted and enacted a plan of correction. In February of 2019, Nurse Vaught was charged with criminally reckless homicide and abuse of an impaired adult, and she pleads not guilty to all charges. And in August, the cause of death is changed from natural to accidental by the medical examiner. In September of 2019, so almost 2 years later, the nursing board reverses its decision to not pursue disciplinary action and instead charges her with unprofessional conduct, abandoning, neglecting a patient, and failing to document the error. Now, due to delays related to COVID, approximately 2 years later, in July of 21, the nursing board revokes her professional license and fines her $3,000. Then in March of this year, when most of us became familiar with the case, is the criminal trial where she was found guilty of the 2 charges and not guilty of the reckless homicide, which is the greater of the charges. And in May of this year, she was sentenced to 3 years of probation.
Thank you, Matt, for getting us on the same page about the timeline of the events. Give me a moment while I get my screen set up here. So now that we all have a shared understanding of how things have unfolded over the past 4 years, my goal is to take a closer look at these errors and to help us get a better understanding of the case before we reframe it with a just culture lens. So we'll go through a sequence of events. It's a very common tool that we use in patient safety investigations, allows us to have a comprehensive, but also 10,000-foot view of the events surrounding an incident, gives us a foundation for that deeper understanding of not only the individuals involved, but also the systems that we're using for patient care. So again, as Matt reviewed, there was a patient in a neurology ICU who was having a brain bleed, but she was stable. She was transferring out of the ICU, and that level of monitoring, those orders were discontinued as she transferred to a step-down unit. There was a PET scan ordered along with some Versed or midazolam for anxiety, and contrast had been administered, and the radiology tech asked the nurse to come to PET scan to administer. The assigned bedside nurse was busy, so a float nurse out of the neuro ICU was asked to help, and that was RaDonda Vaught. She had a trainee with her that day. She performed an override from the automated dispensing unit, and we do know that she withdrew 10 milligrams of vecuronium from that cabinet. There's no documentation of the medication having been administered, but Nurse Vaught did report that she gave 1 milligram in PET. And given that the monitoring parameters had been discontinued from the neuro ICU, Nurse Vaught left after administering the medication. We do know that the patient subsequently suffered, unfortunately, cardiac arrest and passed away the following day after withdrawal of life support. So this is our sequence of events, and I really want to use that to bring up the criminal case against RaDonda Vaught. We'll walk through the so-called fatal errors that occurred according to the prosecution, and these purported errors formed the basis for that criminal case. And that case came out of the Office of the District Attorney, and this was a reminder for us all that there was an anonymous whistleblower who brought this back to attention in late October of 2018. A few months later, RaDonda was charged. The district attorney's office does have prosecutorial discretion to bring these cases to trial. This is an elected position, and the district attorney for Davidson County was reelected in 2022. However, this district attorney's office did face scrutiny for bringing this case forward. So the next 2 slides, I'll go over what the DA brought as these fatal errors in their discovery, which was the basis for their charges against RaDonda Vaught. So we'll start with 5 warnings, followed by 5 red flags that were either bypassed or ignored by the nurse. And we'll try and maintain the actual words and phrasing of the errors as much as possible to keep things clear. So first, Nurse Vaught failed to contact the pharmacy before doing an override, which would be a requirement for a non-emergent order, the first warning. Secondly, when going into the automated dispensing cabinet, there was a pop-up clearly stating paralyzing agent at the top of the list while she was overriding it, and this warning was disregarded. On the subsequent screen, when the selected medication vecuronium would have been popping up, along with a notation again of paralyzing agent in capital letters. Next, there would have been another pop-up screen further explaining the dangers of the medication, repeating paralyzing agent, noting that it causes respiratory distress and it should only be used in patients on ventilators. And the user must press prompt to remove that warning. And then the 5th warning, again, as the quantity of the drug to be administered would have been selected, another pop-up reminding that this is a paralyzing agent would have been present and highlighted in yellow. So these were the 5 warnings that the district attorney's office noted were ignored by Nurse Vaught. And of note, we were unable to find anyone who disputes these facts. Probably safe to accept that these did occur as listed in the district attorney's case. There are also 5 red flags that they brought to trial. First being that vecuronium comes in a powder, which is not something that Versed or midazolam requires. The cap for vecuronium has a bright red color to it and states paralyzing agent, again in capital letters. The third being that, and reading the bottle for the instructions for the reconstitution, again, would have been looking at the bottle, noting that the name of the drug was different than what she was hoping to administer. The instructions rather complicated, and there was another red flag. Again, through the reconstitution process and shaking of the bottle for the reconstitution, another chance to note that this was not likely to be Versed or midazolam as she had expected to administer. And then the last red flag that they brought is that, again, while actually withdrawing the medication from the bottle to draw out the 1 milliliter, would have had another chance to notice the name of the medication was different. So beyond the warnings and the red flags, there were a few more fatal errors that the DA brought. First, that Vaught did not monitor the patient after administering the medication. She also left the patient alone in PET scan after administering the medication. And then finally, that mandated observation protocol would have allowed the patient to capture pending respiratory failure in the patient who passed away. So as Matt mentioned earlier, these are the charges that were brought to RaDonda Vaught, reckless homicide being a more serious charge than the others. She was found not guilty of that, but was found guilty, as we know, of both criminally negligent homicide, as well as gross neglect of an impaired adult. And going back to negligent homicide, the definition of that can differ slightly between states for those of us across the country to know. But she was found guilty of those last two charges. And so I'd like to read this statement directly from the district attorney's office to make sure that their messaging is clear. The jury's conviction of RaDonda Vaught was not an indictment against the nursing profession or the medical community. This case was and always has been about the gross neglect by RaDonda Vaught that caused the death of Charlene Murphy. This was not a singular or momentary mistake. Multiple healthcare professionals were on the jury, and the jury found a series of decisions were made by Vaught to ignore her nursing training and instead failed to adhere to safety protocols that proved to be fatal. The jury felt this level of care was so far below the proper standard of a reasonable and prudent nurse that the verdict was justified. So again, the district attorney is arguing that this nurse was practicing outside of normal standards of care and felt the verdict justified. They went through her, what they called blatant ignoring of multiple warnings and red flags, and what they even called a disrespect for providing safe care, and they thought she needed to be punished under the law. They made sure to state that they were not anti-nurse or seeking retribution against the medical community, that they were simply seeking legal recourse against the nurse who committed these actions. And subsequently, 12 jurors agreed. Their argument was that Vaught was to blame for her actions and found her guilty of negligent homicide and abuse of an impaired adult. So the goal for the remainder of this presentation is to reframe this away from the legal system and think about how we typically analyze medical errors and assign fault. We want to emphasize that the investigation of adverse events or medical errors can and should question human behavior. But these behaviors cannot be extricated from the systems and cultures within which they're allowed to and sometimes are facilitated to occur. We want to explore what policies, or sometimes lack thereof, as well as structural or environmental issues, enabled these multiple mistakes and errors made by a single nurse. With that, I will pass it over to Dr. Prasad.
Unmute myself. Thank you again, Chris, for walking us through the criminal case against RaDonda. So my name is Ramya Prasad, the current Chief Resident in Quality and Patient Safety at the Portland VA, and I will be leading us through a deeper dive exploration of the errors that occurred. As we know, there are always two sides to every story, and we'll take a closer look at these errors through a framework that helps us focus on and explore the system factors that contributed to a series of decisions and behaviors that RaDonda made in this incident. This slide shows us a just culture framework, and this is a tool which healthcare institutions can use to evaluate errors. The framework suggests that behaviors leading to an unintentional error can be categorized into one of three buckets. So here we can see human error, at-risk behavior, and then divided by a vertical red line is reckless behavior. So we know that humans are imperfect and we all make mistakes. And those are the types of behaviors that fit under human error. Some of us might place a wrong order on a patient, while some of us may forget to double check and look to see if a label is the correct medication or product. We know these mistakes will occur, and we can mitigate these through the way we design our systems. We create safeguards and processes and procedures to make our systems safer. The second bucket is at-risk behaviors, and these are those that people will lapse into for ease. An example would be common use of overrides on an automated dispensing cabinet to immediately retrieve a medication, or perhaps having 2 patient charts open because it's faster. These are things that we know are not best practice, but they help us get our work done more quickly. And usually we don't really experience consequences from them, so we feel emboldened to continue with them. We can manage at-risk behaviors as a system through streamlining processes to minimize necessary steps and removing incentives to taking shortcuts for those processes. And then the final bucket we have is reckless behavior, and reckless behavior is a conscious disregard of risk. Examples would be showing up to work drunk or refusing a patient-informed consent before a procedure. And this is where we start to apply remediation and punitive action. So the way this table was designed suggests that these categories are very clear-cut and discrete, but realistically, these buckets exist along a subjective spectrum. Things like conscious disregard of risk are difficult to tease out in medical errors because our analysis is usually based on witnessed or reported behaviors of incidents or chart review or testimony rather than in-the-moment thought processes. And then one additional feature we'd like to point out is that the outcome of an error is not part of the equation when determining appropriate corrective action. Rather, the focus is on choices, if there are any, behind a behavior and the behavior itself. A system based on harm or outcomes rewards the lucky and punishes the unlucky. Removing outcomes allows us to focus on systems issues instead of the individual who was unlucky enough to have an error result in patient harm. So this diagram is from our home institution, Oregon Health and Science University, and describes the interplay between the shared vision of continuous process improvement, reporting, and a just culture. The reason a just culture framework emphasizes that mistakes are a byproduct of faulty systems rather than individual behaviors is to create a psychologically safe environment in which personnel can be transparent about errors and reporting. Staff will be more trusting and engaged and will understand mistakes and errors won't be punished when they inadvertently occur, further encouraging a reporting culture to grow. With robust systems in place to investigate and learn from these incidents, we can mitigate root causes of errors, better support our employees, and improve the quality and value of care received by patients. The Just Culture framework and improvement efforts have become widely embraced as a standard of practice across the medical community, but the reality of how accurately we hold to these standards can be debated. We'll now use a cause and effect diagram to further characterize the errors that were made. So this diagram is a tool commonly used in patient safety to understand the events that led up to an error. It hones in on systems factors rather than individual factors that we heard from the DA, such as the physical environment or technology, personnel, and management or policies. We can then ask exhaustively why to work backwards until we identify a root cause of the incident or the error. So this cause and effect diagram was developed after reading everything we possibly could about this case, and the information primarily comes from the CMS report following their on-site survey at Vanderbilt University Medical Center and RaDonda's Tennessee Nursing Board hearing. We do want to reiterate that we do not work at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, and there are certain pieces of unpublished information that we may not be privy to. We can't be 100% certain there are no errors in this diagram as outsiders of the institution being discussed. So we'll start with technology. On the left side of the text, you can see that a recent EMR upgrade had caused delays in orders reaching the automated dispensing cabinet, and overrides were very frequently used as a result, as evidenced by the fact that Charlene had almost over 20 overrides in the initial 48 hours of her hospitalization. The behavior that had largely been normalized as a workaround for the EMR issues. Secondarily, several system issues contributed to retrieval of the wrong medication. So the EMR allowed providers to order brand name medications, but the automated dispensing cabinets only dealt with and displayed generic names. And secondarily, the automated dispensing cabinet only required 2 letters to search for medication. As far as the environment in which RaDonda was working, she had both equipment and time restraints working against her. Contrast had already been given to complete the PET scan, and subsequently, administration of the sedative medication was time sensitive. RaDonda felt rushed to provide the medication to minimize the need for additional contrast and to prevent delays in the diagnostic study. And there were unfortunately no barcode scanners available in the radiology suite, so RaDonda wasn't able to verify the medication prior to administration. So this table from Kaiser Health News shows similar incidents that have occurred between 2017 and 2022. As you can see, when using just a few letters, 2 to 3 letters to search for medications, there are numerous other reported incidents in which a medication other than intended was withdrawn, the first 2 being vecuronium instead of Versed. It's likely just a small sampling of a much larger issue, as reporting of these errors isn't mandatory. And automated dispensing system companies are seemingly aware of this issue and have made some attempts to mitigate the errors. So Omnicell added a software upgrade in 2020 to require 5 letters to search for medications, but the upgrade was opt-in and minimally used. And Pyxis has said for 2.5 years that it will make 5 letters standard. But even with these efforts for system improvement, misspellings still occur with individuals who are retrieving medications. So returning to our cause and effect diagram, we'll now talk about people and personnel. RaDonda missed alerts from the automated dispensing cabinet. As previously discussed, there was likely some contribution from alert fatigue and selective vision, given how frequently overrides were being used. But she had also been training an orientee and was distracted while retrieving the medication. It seems there was no clear policy about distractions or work with trainees during medication pulls. And we know that she missed the printed paralytic agent that was on the vial. But we do know that the vial of vecuronium was minimally distinguishable from other lower risk medications. When asked by the Tennessee Nursing Board how she missed the warning on the vial cap, which she must have punctured to reconstitute the medication, RaDonda responded, "If it was there, I did not acknowledge it. It's easy to get complacent with your systems and trust what you believe you pulled from that system." So this is an example of confirmation bias. She trusted that the technology she was interfacing with was functional and correct, and that the automated dispensing cabinet had provided the appropriate medication. Interestingly, accidental retrieval and administration of a paralytic agent is a known and previously documented issue. A 2009 report from Pennsylvania outlined at least 154 reported or discovered events of paralytic retrieval over a 5-year period. And in just under half of these reports, patients were accidentally administered a neuromuscular blocking agent. The Institute for Safe Medication Practices, or ISMP, released a report in 2016 further describing the dangers of paralytic agents and factors contributing to their accidental administration. They produced a number of recommendations, including judicious storage of the medication, so only in places that'll be used like the OR, ED, or ICU. Unique packaging to really set it aside and distinguish the medication, such as those seen on the right of the slide. And then changing the simple paralyzing agent on the vial to really bold letters and warning paralyzing agent causes respiratory distress. Unfortunately, none of these changes had made their way to Vanderbilt by late 2017. And finally, we'll talk about management. So there are a few issues here, and it appears there was largely some confusion around medication documentation, and vecuronium administration was not originally recorded in the chart. As Matt had said, when RaDonda realized that she had administered the wrong medication, she disclosed the medication error to her supervisors and was told there was no need to document in the EMR and just simply submit a safety report. Additionally, RaDonda was told she didn't need to monitor the patient following sedative administration in the radiology suite, which seems in line with recent discontinuation of monitoring orders and plans to transfer to a lower level of care. So to recap our systems issues, number one being the EMR allowed interchangeable use of brand and generic names for medication. There was a widespread override use and normalization as a workaround for software issues. There was no clear policy or standardization for either A, working with an orientee, or B, post-sedation surveillance. At the time at Vanderbilt University, vecuronium packaging and storage was minimally distinguishable from other medications. And finally, there was no barcode scanner available in the radiology suite as a backup check. So using our patient safety lens and a just culture framework, I want to reanalyze the fatal errors that the DA suggested. We know that mistakes were made and we're not denying RaDonda's role in the occurrence of these errors, but what we really want to ask is, were the errors entirely the results of a nurse consciously disregarding safety, or were the systems in place that allowed or even facilitated these errors to occur? So when looking at the warnings she missed or bypassed or overrode, she clearly made some errors there, but many people click through warnings without reading or processing them. We consider both of these as demonstrations of at-risk behavior. For her next fatal error, not recognizing that she retrieved the wrong medication, we had a lot of discussion within our team, and we were pretty between human error or at-risk behavior. We ended up arguing for human error as the result of cognitive bias. You know, as we previously discussed, she trusted that she was interfacing with the automated dispensing cabinet appropriately and was provided the right medication. But we also considered the potential for at-risk behavior, as she'd been discussing with and distracted by conversation with an orientee at the time of medication pull. If we go back to our cause and effect diagram, we know the system's issues underlying these behaviors were primarily the widespread and normalized use of overrides and the additional responsibility of working with an orientee, in addition to numerous limitations of the dispensing cabinet in regard to searches for brand name medications. She didn't notice, or at least didn't process, the warnings on the vial, which we again consider human error in the setting of confirmation bias. And she reconstituted the powder formulation and administered the medication without scanning to verify, both of which are at-risk behaviors. The major systems factors contributing here beyond confirmation bias were the time pressures, ease of access to a neuromuscular blocking agent, and the lack of a barcode scanner. She very clearly recognized that not scanning the medication was inappropriate, but felt it was in the best interest of the patient to receive the medication so she could complete the study to expedite care. And finally, we know RaDonda did not monitor the patient in the radiology suite or document the medication administration. Both of these we consider human error in the setting of authority bias. When RaDonda inquired, she was told there was no monitoring requirement and there was no need to document vecuronium use, since she was already submitting a patient safety report. And with that, I will let Anne take over.
If you could stop sharing your screen so I can take it
Sure.
over.
Oop. It is not allowing me to.
There we go. Hopefully that worked. So I want to spend the remainder of the time that we have together to talk about reframing the errors that we just analyzed along the framework of a just culture. So as Ramya had described to you earlier, this is the framework we use for a just culture. And when you think about all the errors that RaDonda committed, of which there were many, you can begin to question how much of the blame falls on her shoulders alone. Yes, she did make mistakes, but there were also clearly many faulty systems at play that allowed those mistakes to reach the patient. And this is our analysis of the just culture, and we admit that there are other people who might analyze this case and come to separate conclusions. But when we look at this and we see that all of these errors occurred, we have to put on our systems thinking hat and think that this is really not just the actions of a reckless nurse, but rather many systems aligning in that classic Swiss cheese model to allow an error to reach the patient at their bedside. And I can imagine myself in her shoes. I mean, I have skipped through warnings before. I have placed orders while being distracted by a trainee or a student. I felt rushed when completing my work and just trying to get things done. And I think the truth is that all of us have. And so when we think about this through a just culture lens, we just can't see a reckless nurse. We see a healthcare system that needs to do a better job of protecting its patients and protecting its staff. And there are ways that we can further analyze a just culture using decision support tools. So the VA National Center for Patient Safety produced this decision support tool that's relatively widely used to help institutions respond to employee errors. And it essentially follows a 3-step process where you choose a column that describes the employee's action. You ask yourself, would other employees with similar skills and knowledge do the same thing? And then you ask yourself, finally, are there repeated errors or occurrences of at-risk behavior that have occurred with this employee to suggest that it is a pattern? And this allows employers to do a better job of framing employee errors in a just culture framework. Now, we are not suggesting, nor does just culture suggest, that this is a blame-free culture. Because to be honest, you have to think about this on a spectrum, right? There are things that are grossly negligent and grossly reckless, of which employees should face consequences and remediation for. But we don't want to go to the other end of the spectrum either and create a punitive culture where people become afraid of error reporting because they're afraid of their personal consequences to that. The idea of a just culture is that it takes characteristics from both the blame-free and punitive culture and finds that perfect, appropriate balance to facilitate thoughtful and fair responses to errors. And when we are able to create a just culture, we realize that this really does a better job of promoting a safe environment for our patients as well as for our healthcare workers. Now, this does not change the legal response that happens within our system. We can't control the DA's choice to prosecute RaDonda Vaught. We can't control the way that her defense ran the defense side of her case, nor what the prosecution decided to bring forward. But what we can do is a much better job of preventing the types of scenarios that Nurse Vaught found herself in. And we can ensure that we're working in a culture that is continually improving and making sure that patient safety is a priority. And we know that when we build a just culture, that it increases error reporting. And the truth is we can't make systems safer if we don't know what's going wrong, right? We have to create a psychologically safe environment where employees are free to report errors, near misses, events, so that we then as a system can fix them. Through constant attention to improvement, we can create systems that work for, not against, healthcare providers. We need to focus on systems and not on blaming people. Any of us can be unlucky. Any of us can make a series of mistakes that leads to an error reaching a patient. And if we're honest with ourselves, and you've practiced long enough, you have probably had an error occur on a patient or been in situations where you were saved by the system. Right? Like the pharmacist who copped your wrong order on the wrong patient, the nurse who didn't give the medication, the alert that actually saved you. And these are there for a reason, right? So that we can try to prevent these errors from actually reaching the bedside. And finally, when we create this just culture, we unite staff and healthcare systems to make sure that our healthcare is safer and better. By creating a shared vision of the future, we can essentially align with our institutions and imagine a world where instead of being fired, RaDonda was offered grief counseling, that an RCA was conducted with extensive and widespread institutional dissemination of the findings, where the family and the state were transparently notified of the events that occurred, and that systems were improved to help mitigate harm. A just culture doesn't fix our legal system, but it provides a huge layer of protection between us as healthcare providers and that legal system. And I do want to speak a little bit more to error reporting, because this is one way for us as providers to become actively involved in creating our just culture. As we've discussed, this is really the foundation of a fundamental just culture. And reporting of adverse events, near misses, These are all important to how we create that safety culture. And if you work in healthcare, you're likely familiar with the fact that medical errors happen. Well, they happen a lot. They're incredibly common. But what you might not be aware of is that medical errors disproportionately impact our vulnerable populations. There are studies that show people of color, women, non-native English speakers, socioeconomically disadvantaged individuals, uninsured populations, that these are all populations that are more likely to experience an error. So when we think about the importance of building a just culture, we really need to realize that this not just impacts our patients, not only impacts us as providers, but it specifically impacts our most vulnerable and disadvantaged patients. Finally, we would be remiss if we did not spend just a few minutes acknowledging the ripple effects of this error outside of the legal ramifications and the loss of life of Charlene Murphy. In any case where an error occurs, there is a second victim. And that second victim is us, the provider. We are traumatized by the consequences of our unintentional actions. And when asked to talk about the impact of this error, RaDonda said this, and I'd like to read the quote because it's quite impactful. "I won't ever be the same person. I know the reason this patient is no longer here is because of me. There won't be a day that goes by that I don't think about what I did and how it's affected them. And at the end of the day, my life won't ever be the same because of this." So RaDonda became a second victim, the healthcare provider who was involved in a negative adverse event and who is unintentionally traumatized by it. And acknowledging the effect errors have on medical providers is important. We know that most errors are human errors or at-risk errors, and that they're completely unintentional, but they can be nonetheless deeply emotionally distressing and personally devastating. The absence of tragic results or harm to a patient, even without that, the consequences and the cumulative effect of errors, they can be heavy. They can be overwhelming to us as providers. And it can cause both personal as well as professional impacts. This is a graph from a study of 3,200 American and Canadian physicians. And it looked at the consequence of what happens after an error occurs. And it showed that physicians developed increased anxiety about future errors, decreased job satisfaction, decreased job confidence, increased sleeplessness. And what's even more disturbing is that minor errors or near misses had a significant effect on physicians as well, causing symptoms in up to 30% of respondents. And we bring up second victim because we realize that this is incredibly important as part of that foundation of building a just culture. Because we not only need to protect our patients, but we also have to protect ourselves because there are real harms to everyone involved in a medical error. And sometimes those harms can extend outside of even just the patient. So we hope that we've given you a better understanding of what happened with RaDonda Vaught, what a just culture is and what it means to build a just culture within our healthcare community. We are certainly not the only group that has questioned the legal response and tried to reframe this case in a medical response. Many organizations have come forward to speak out about the criminal prosecution of RaDonda for an unintentional act. Here's some quotes from the American Nursing Association and the IHI, which are just a few of the multitude of organizations that came out to speak against her criminal charges. A lot of them saying things like criminalizing the honest reporting of mistakes is deeply distressing, that it diverts attention from needed system level problems and solutions. And we really agree wholeheartedly with these statements and believe that the strongest response that we can make as a medical community is to double down on our commitment to a just culture, to building an environment where unintentional medical errors do not result in individual blame, but in solutions to make our health systems better. As we have previously discussed, we have limited control over the legal system, but we can control the medical system, and we can control the responses that we build within the medical system and the protections that we build. And we can demand a just culture from our hospitals and from our healthcare systems, and create an environment where instead of asking whose fault is this, we commit ourselves to asking what happened here and why. The IHI has further responded by publishing a series of steps that they recommend healthcare systems take to promote a just culture and systems level accountability after an error occurs. So the first thing being that if an error occurs, we minimize further harm to the patient, which goes without question. Transparent reporting that is encouraged. Transparent communication with patients and families about the error. Apologize. We know that this improves patient satisfaction, decreases civil litigations, and patients deeply appreciate it. Provide immediate and long-term support to all staff involved. That leadership is alerted to understand how the system failed and how we can improve it for the future. Thoroughly investigate the incident. Follow through to ensure that the lessons that we learn from the incident are incorporated. And we pay attention to near misses to proactively fix systems before we have devastating consequences like what occurred for Charlene Murphy. These are excellent tools and steps that can be taken at a systems level and should be taken. There are also things that as individuals we can do and should do in order to promote just cultures at our hospitals. The first is that we have to error report. As we've previously emphasized, we can't fix problems that we don't know exist. And they have to build a foundation where error reporting is part of that. We know that physicians are historically pretty terrible at error reporting and tend to report less than 5% of the medical errors at any given institution, the vast majority being done by nurses. As medical leaders, as physicians, as people who work with trainees, it needs to be our job to model this behavior to create safer environments for our patients and for ourselves. If you feel like culture change within the medical community is not enough for you and you bristle about the legal aspects of this, I encourage you to explore advocacy as another venue. There was a change.org petition that went out before RaDonda's sentencing hearing that gained nearly 200,000 signatures. And while I can't say if that affected the judge's ruling, she's only serving probation and is not going to serve jail time. So certainly it didn't seem to harm it. But if you want to further your advocacy caps, there are ways to express your support for whatever viewpoint it is that you may have. You can write letters to the Tennessee governor, the Department of Health, the district attorney's office, and become involved as a healthcare physician or other healthcare provider to make your voice known about how you feel about this case. Finally, I think the most powerful way we can all become involved is to locally become involved with our systems levels at our local community hospitals. To build a just culture, we need more systems thinkers. We need to bolster understanding and involvement in this field to create mutual support and fairness that allows us to learn and mitigate from mistakes. Become involved in quality improvement. Make systems better. Join a patient safety committee that investigates errors and bring your systems thinking caps to that. Build a curriculum on health system science for medical students or trainees. We teach the next generation how to do this better than we do it. Attend lectures and conferences that focus on patient safety and quality improvement. These are ways to keep yourself accountable to the vision of how we create a just culture within our healthcare institutions. With that, I hope that we have spent the last 50 minutes helping everyone to understand the available facts around the case of RaDonda Vaught and analyze the case using our patient safety lens. And finally, that people have a little better understanding of how we apply a just culture and steps that both our institutions and us as individuals can take to further prevent errors in the future. We use quite a few references in the creation of this talk, and these are open to the public. We highly encourage anyone who wants to read more about this case to access some of these. And with that, we thank you for your attention and the time, and we want to open the floor to any questions or discussion. Thank you so much. If anyone wants to unmute or drop a question into the chat that has not been already answered by Dr. DeVeronica and Dr. Turnup, we are happy to field those.
I have a question. It was such a great talk, really a good summary of the case. And I was just wondering how you present this. I maybe missed the very beginning, so maybe you said that, but are you like using this case with your trainees? How are you using it? A little bit more detail about like, is this the exact presentation you give your trainees, or how are you addressing it with them?
Yeah, so we actually did this case with our trainees initially, with our interns from our Wellbeing and Improvement Science curriculum. And it was not this exact presentation that happened essentially immediately after the jury conviction occurred. So back in kind of April or so, this case built out of what we taught our trainees. So we kind of developed, it's the same, is a less refined version of what we just gave because we had to develop that initially. And so that's how we actually started with creating this, and then have used it as then the ground rounds at our local institution.
To follow up on that, I just want to, I mean, yes, this was a great presentation, and I think it really does offer almost a role model M&M for other institutions. And I would encourage you, and now I'm blanking on the online forum that you can post your coursework, but I could really imagine a way to present this to almost teach other institutes, to encourage them to do it as an M&M. But for this has such clear-cut things to identify that I think many institutions struggle with their personal M&Ms, being able to form them into the right format. And this could actually give them a good mental model of what that could look like, almost with cue cards for what the fishbone that you all had, those types of things. And I think this could be a really outstanding curricular innovation to share.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rogers. And yes, we will likely work on trying to get this posted either through an online publication through something like NetEd Portal, or we're actually working on developing a health system science website with the AMA that we may end up posting it on called teachis.org. So it will eventually find its way online, but we haven't quite got that far. Other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, we'll give everyone 5 minutes back into their day. And we thank you so much for your attention and time today, and wish you all a lovely day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.